The Eagles did it last year with Georgia. But who potentially could be the team that the Eagles go all in when it comes to the draft? We're going to figure it out when we boil it down in our March Madness bracket. But first, we're talking about the tush push and how it ain't freaking leaving. If you like it or not, Eagles fans love it. All that and more on today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome on in, everyone, to a Friday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, your only daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, giving you episodes 5 days each and every week, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. I'm your host, Gino Camilleri, Eagles expert, scouting director here at LOE, and we thank you for being our first listen each and every day. Today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Right now, new customers, especially during March Madness time, join today and you'll get $200 in bonus bets. It's your first $5 bet or more wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So as I said on the intro, it's March Madness. I got this idea because Lou had tweeted out earlier in the day, what if the Eagles went double dipping in the Clemson pool? If they went, let's say, Nate Wiggins and then Jeremiah Trotter Jr., for example. Well, the Eagles did that last year with Georgia. I mean, basically the entire draft, they did that. So I got 8 teams, got their top 5 prospects according to PFF's big board, and I did bracket mode. And I want to boil it down. What team could the Eagles go all in on this year like they did with Georgia last year? But first, we have to talk about arguably the biggest news of the week, and I would say the biggest Philly moment for all of us who we chant the words, no one likes us, we don't care. Well, folks, a lot of people hate the tush push. Caused a lot of commotion, a lot of hullabaloo on Twitter and ESPN and some major networks, and here at the Locked On Podcast Network, everybody was talking about this play. And a play to me, which I think defines football, in my opinion, the idea that it isn't, quote, a football play is completely ridiculous. It is the legal definition of going to war, football. I mean, you're essentially going to war without weapons. What's the closest that you're going to get in hand-to-hand combat? In the trenches, my friend. And that's the equivalent of like rugby scrums and all of the full contact sports. I mean, low man wins. We're arguing against playing with leverage and trying to move the line of scrimmage and just pure domination and how the game was formed. We didn't even have the forward pass for how many years? And people are complaining about this, that we're getting back to a physical game. If you want to stop it, go ahead. Teams stopped it last year, but not for the Eagles, outside of one time. But teams around the NFL tried it. It isn't that easy. People think it's simple. Well, the Eagles do it well because they practice it. They had the best center in football last year with 2 offensive guards that can move the pile. Is it going to be a little bit different this year? For sure. You're not going to have Jason Kelce in the equation. It's definitely going to look different, but it's still going to be in football. I think removing plays from football, unless there's a clear disadvantage. So, for example, Jim Brown, one of the best running backs in the National Football League ever, is also known for how good he was at lacrosse. So in lacrosse, you hold a stick with a little tiny net on the top, but the one thing you can't do is use your hand to cover the ball and hold it in the stick. Well, Jim Brown used to do that. He used to do a little creative trick where he would put his thumb over it, go down the field, and imagine trying to stop somebody that is an NFL running back playing lacrosse in that era. They completely changed the rule because that was just clearly an unfair disadvantage. The idea of using stickum on your hands, yeah, that's an unfair disadvantage. Look at baseball right now. You can't do anything to make your game have a disadvantage over somebody else by something that has to do without just the game itself. Like stickum is substance you have to go and buy and put on your hands and try and hide it and sneak it in. And I mean, heck, you talk about like in hockey, the advantage of like cutting your hands out of your gloves. Like even that advantage can give you a little bit of leg up, but it's not illegal. There are things that are illegal, and then there are things that you can do that are just trying to give you a leg up. And Lane Johnson jokingly said that he jumps off sides every time or false starts every time because his coach tells him to do it. Well, the thing is, there's a difference between breaking the rules and towing the line. And what the Eagles are doing with the tush push is definitely towing the line. But I think it's ridiculous to outlaw this play. You're talking about 11 guys putting their head down, putting their hard hat on and saying, move me from point A to point V. 4,000 pounds a man. You have to move them. Like scenes out of Game of Thrones when they're just clashing shields together. I don't know why people are getting all Charmin soft about this. Like, let them play this play. It makes no sense. I'm glad Troy Vincent put it to bed. There's a difference between clearly breaking the rules, i.e. Jim Brown putting his thumb over the ball when playing lacrosse, and stick 'em, and just things that'll give you a little bit of a leg up, like cutting your hand out of your glove, like your little palm when you're playing hockey so you can get a better grip on the ball. Or heck, I mean, even in baseball, I mean, these guys are still using, tack on the baseball bat. Like, that's an advantage, but you're not going to not do it because it's morally wrong or whatever your big brain idea wants to get with it. The tush push isn't going anywhere. It's a QB sneak. We're overcomplicating things just to overcomplicate them. We're getting mad just to get mad. Whoosah. We can stop talking about this at least for another year. Thank you, Troy Vincent, former Philadelphia Eagle. It's good to see that this play will be back in football, even though Saquon Barkley is probably going to get these handoffs and this play is probably going to look a little bit different moving forward. But at the same time, we don't need to change football for the worse. Change it for the better. Focus on the kickoff, potentially changing the onside kick rule, leave the tush push to the people that run it well. That's the Philadelphia Eagles. One thing I don't really do well is pick brackets, but one thing I do love is the draft. So I tried to combine the two, and that's what we're going to start talking about after we get back on this episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast. This episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. Right now, you're probably doing a million things, and your friends are saying, hey, when are we going to hang out? But you're like, oh, my social battery is absolutely drained. It's easy to ignore your friends. It's easy to ignore yourself. And at the same time, therapy can be a way to give you the self-awareness that you need to build your social battery back up. Trust me, folks, we sit on this side of the mic. Everything seems good and dandy. But 23 and a half hours of the day, we deal with a lot of things. Both Lou and I are big proponents of our friends over at BetterHelp. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to fit your schedule. After you fill out a brief questionnaire, you'll be matched with a licensed therapist. If you don't like that therapist, you can switch at any time for no additional charge. Find your social sweet spot with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. That's LOCKEDON. And once again, we thank BetterHelp for sponsoring the Locked On Eagles podcast. All right, everyone, Gino Camilleri rolling on this Friday edition of LOE. If you're listening here, wherever you get your podcast on YouTube, make sure you subscribe, like, make sure you interact with us on Twitter all the time. We're talking birds when we are not talking them here. And if you want to listen to some good stuff, and I'm not talking about Fox Sports, ESPN, where you're watching your TV all day and you kind of have to turn down your volume with all that shouting, I suggest you make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for your everyday to bring you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. And speak of every day, that's what we've been getting every day is basketball. It's March Madness. It is NCAA tournament time. And I haven't filled out a bracket in a couple of years. I'm a Syracuse basketball fan. They've just been downright terrible. And I've been out of the loop on college basketball a little bit. But when it's tournament time, I get back in just like all of us do. And I got this idea today. Well, actually, Lou gave me the idea. Well, actually, the Eagles gave us this idea because last year, the Eagles decided we're going to just draft every Georgia player on the face of the earth. So I said, what team could the Eagles do that with this year? And they could walk out of this draft and say, heck, we walked away filling needs. We walked away with some pretty darn good players. And we didn't even have to change the logo on the card when we submitted it to Roger Goodell. So I went through PFF's big board. I went through the top 8 teams when it comes to prospects that I could get 5 that were top of the line guys, but I cheated a little bit. I went Alabama, Washington, Texas, Oregon, Michigan, Penn State, Florida State. I was trying to get an 8, so I made an Iowa quote-unquote team, which is made up of guys from Iowa, Iowa State, and the University of Northern Iowa. So how I did this, I tried to stick to March Madness. Alabama gets the 1 seed, seeing that they are the highest ranked team in March Madness. Go figure, Alabama getting the 1 when it comes to football. Then on to Texas, then on to Oregon, and then the remaining teams, I kind of just did it based on how I thought the overall roster that I picked looked. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the first 4. Then in segment 3, we're going to get to the second 4, and then we'll go all the way to the finals. So to start, we're going to start with our 1 versus 8 seed. Alabama versus Iowa. So this Iowa team, it's made up of Cooper DeJean, TJ Tampa. You're probably thinking Iowa State. That's how I got there. Eric All, tight end, if you aren't familiar. Christian Boyd, interior defensive lineman, who is at the Senior Bowl from the University of Northern Iowa. And Logan Lee is also an interior defensive lineman from the University of Iowa. That 5-man roster, went with a 5-man roster for basketball, getting a little creative, give me some credit, is going up against the powerhouse, Alabama. Terrion Arnold, Dallas Turner, Chris Braswell, Kool-Aid McKinstry, and J.C. Latham. Now, when I'm doing this, I'm doing it under the moniker of how would the Eagles walk away? Would they walk away with a roster that looks more complete with this team? I'm not just doing the best 5, right? Can make the argument that adding Cooper DeJean and TJ Tampa, I mean, you really are going to solidify your boundary, right? But you know who else can do that? Kool-Aid McKinstry, Terrion Arnold, the number 1 corner in the draft. And at the same time, you can get 2 edge rushers in Dallas Turner, Chris Braswell. J.C. Latham could be that swing tackle for you right away. Could potentially be that right tackle of the future for you. Eric All, middle of the road tight end for Iowa. Wouldn't mind him behind Dallas Goedert. Christian Boyd, the Eagles are talked to have a lot of interest in him. Potentially could be. Logan Lee, that run-stopping type of interior defensive lineman. They could add another one of those. But I think Alabama, the 1 seed, way too big of a powerhouse. So round 1 goes to Alabama. They're big 5. Moving on. So then we go to the other big seed. Texas versus Penn State. Penn State, folks, probably got a little excited. But man, Texas is good. Texas is really good. Let's start out with this Texas roster. You're going to walk away with A.D. Mitchell, Xavier Worthy, Byron Murphy. Oh, throw J.T. Sanders in there as the 3rd pass catcher out of that group. And then Tavondre Sweat to be your 2nd Jordan Davis. Pretty good little rotation you got there. Go to number 7, Penn State. Think everybody will get a little excited. Might have some homers on this one. But heck, this underrated number 7 team, they got some guys. I didn't do a lot of upsets. This is as close as it came. Because with Penn State, you have Olu Fashanu, Chop Robinson, Adiza Isaac, Kalen King, and Theo Johnson. Now, you would fill more roster holes for the Eagles with those 4, in my opinion. With those 5, rather. But man, how explosive would that Eagles offense be with A.D. Mitchell and Xavier Worthy being your number 3 and your number 4 receivers. And then you throw JT Sanders in there as your next up at tight end. And T'Vondre Sweat is just as good as Jordan Davis when it comes to defending the run, when it comes to being that big and getting off the ball. And then, heck, Byron Murphy, you lose Fletcher Cox, you replace Fletcher Cox. You add somebody next to Jalen Carter who can do a lot of what Jalen Carter can do. As many holes as the Penn State team would address on this Eagles roster, that Texas powerhouse team, man, I just think it's way too good to pass up what you could get on offense. And you talk about having an all-world team, talk about the 3 ball being money in today's day and age. Number 14, Oakland goes out there and beats Kentucky because they just drain 3s all day long. Well, that's going to be the Eagles offense when they're just throwing up 6s to number whatever they were, but to Xavier Worthy and A.D. Mitchell. I think that would be a powerhouse unit. But see what we're doing here now. We got 2 more matchups, the Final 4, and then the championship. Who's going to take it all? Keep watching along here or listening on this episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast. This episode of LOE is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney, and I'm sure in the first round, after the first game, your bracket was already busted. So if you want to stay in on the action, getting in on all the fun, there's only one place you can do it. It's the official sportsbook of LOE, the entire Locked On Podcast Network, and the number 1 sportsbook in America. That's FanDuel. All new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first winning $5 bet hits. That's $200 in bonus bets. 40 times your money if your first $5 money line or any prop or parlay wager wins. Just an Abraham Lincoln. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. We thank FanDuel for being the official sponsor of the entire Locked On Podcast Network, LOE, and the number 1 sportsbook in America. All right, everyone, finishing up this Friday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. After you get done with this, back to March Madness, but we're talking brackets right now. We just did our 1 versus 8, our 2 versus 7. We're getting to the 3 versus 6. We got the 4 versus 5 right now, then the Final 4, and then our championship. So let's go to the 3 versus 6 with the Oregon Ducks against the Michigan Wolverines. We will start with the underdog, Michigan Wolverines. You could go with defensive lineman Marshawn Nealon, cornerback Mike Sainristil, wide receiver Roman Wilson, adding Chris Jenkins on the line as well, and then linebacker Junior Colson. Going against my Oregon Ducks with Jackson Powers Johnson, cornerback Khyree Jackson, wide receiver Troy Franklin, defensive lineman Brandon Dorlus, and running back Bucky Irving. This one was close. I like Roman Wilson a lot. Mike Sainristil, good cornerback. Khyree Jackson, better cornerback in my opinion. Troy Franklin, just as good as Roman Wilson, can do more stuff outside for you. Jackson Powers Johnson's going to be a 10-year pro and probably a Hall of Famer. And Brandon Dorlus is really, really good. And people are underrating him. And so is Bucky Irving, even though he didn't test well athletically. That Michigan roster was very, very good. But a lot of the guys that got drafted last year and the year before, the Aiden Hutchinsons, those are the guys with the ceilings. I see this Oregon team having a lot of guys with ceilings. The Michigan team, I think you know what you're going to get out of that team. Very good. I would like the Eagles to draft some of those guys, but if we're going just a 5-man lineup, JPJ instantly replaces Jason Kelce for you. Khyree Jackson could potentially be your next cornerback number one. His size, athleticism, speed. Troy Franklin's a very good number three who could develop into the number two down the road, but as a number three, he's going to be great. And then Brandon Dorless, you need somebody to bop in and out on that defensive line. There you go. Bucky Irving, he ranked number one according to Pro Football Focus. The exact what they called it was, I think, yards after missed tackles or forced missed tackles or something along the lines of that. But Bucky Irving was at the top of it. Those are the guys that you can get tricked up in when it comes to athletic testing. Going with Oregon over Michigan here. No upset so far. We're on to the 4 versus 5. Washington versus number 5, Florida State. Washington has Rome Odunze, Jalen Polk, Jalen McMillan. You're getting a whole bunch of firepower when it comes to the wide receiver position. Edge rusher, Braylon Trice, and offensive lineman Troy Fautanu. Going up against Florida State, where you got Jared Verse, Braden Fisk, Keon Coleman, Johnny Wilson, and Trey Benson. Trey Benson at running back. He was in that Oregon room a couple years ago. Probably one of the better backs when it comes to long speed explosiveness in this class. You know what? I picked Florida State coming into this, but the idea of doing what you did with Texas with all that offensive firepower and still adding Braylon Trice, who's, I would say, a poor man's Latu out of UCLA. Technician, length, explosiveness off the edge. And then Troy Fautanu. That's your heir apparent at right tackle. I'm switching up. I'm going all favorites on a underdog podcast. All right, let's get to the next round. We got the 1 versus the 3, Alabama versus Oregon. Alabama, I think, by far is the best situation for the Eagles to walk out of this draft and be like, okay, we got 5 guys at 5 positions, and they're all going to be impact players for us. Even though the spread isn't as good when it comes to getting a guy at every different position, you're getting 2 very good cornerbacks in Terrion Arnold and Kool-Aid McKinstry, and 2 very good edge rushers in Dallas Turner and Chris Braswell, and then J.C. Latham, who they love Alabama offensive linemen in Philadelphia. They do pretty good with them. Seems that they can be coached up pretty good in Jeff Stoutland. I can't be a homer. It's got to be Alabama there over Oregon. Going to the 2 versus 4, Texas versus Washington, a game we saw in college football. I'm changing it again. I'm going to go with Washington on this one. And the reason why is the offensive line. You're going to get 3 really good wide receivers, which might, can argue it's going to take away the ball from some people, but you could argue that with A.D. Mitchell, and you could argue that with Xavier Worthy. Where I think Washington has the upper hand, though, is you don't have a Troy Fautanu on the roster. Braylon Trice, take him or leave him, whatever you think for this exercise, but Texas doesn't have an edge rusher. They got 2 guys on the interior, which I think the Eagles are better suited for long-term than the edge position. So I'm going to go with Washington. I had Washington losing the first round. They're making a little bit of a run. I know my Oregon inside, I'm hurting. My Oregon fans are going to be upset with me. But in the national championship, we have Alabama against Washington. Washington was there. Alabama was not. I have to go with Alabama on this one. You aren't going to get that crazy offensive firepower. Heck, you're only going to get an offensive lineman, but to solidify the outside corner positions and the edge position to where you have Bryce Huff, and it's like, oh, if we want Joshua to walk, he can now, and if we want Hassan Reddick to walk, he can, and we could cut James Bradbury and don't have to repay Darius Slay again and hope he just continues to not age, and all of a sudden you got Terrion Arnold and Kool-Aid McKinstry to be your number 1 and 2, and Dallas Turner and Chris Braswell would be really good in a rotation right off the bat with what they have there and could potentially be the bookends. And then J.C. Latham, not nearly as much upside as Troy Fautanu. We know that. But can Jeff Stoutland make a player? 100%. So I hope you enjoyed that exercise. I would love to hear what you would think. I'll tweet this out as well, each team, who the 5 guys were. This could be a legitimate thing that happens again. The Eagles went to the well last year with Georgia. Went Georgia. They're all dogs. Who are they going to be this year? Philly Tide? Yeah. Philly Ducks? Don't mind that. Philly Wolverines? Whatever, Penn State. Philly Nittany Lions. Ugh, don't like the sound of that. Whatever they may be, they're going to get some good ball players if they pick from any of these schools. Will it be a full-fledged Georgia approach? I don't know. Probably not. That was a once-in-a-lifetime thing that I think we are going to see. But all in all, it's a good experiment. I hope you enjoyed it. Enjoy your weekend. Enjoy all of the basketball that you are going to – I almost said football. All the basketball you're going to take in with this March Madness NCAA tournament. Stay happy. Stay healthy. Thank you for always downloading, making us your number one listen. First listen each and every day. Make sure you are watching the 24/7 Locked On Sports Today channel on YouTube while you're there. Subscribe to our show. It's the way that we keep the wives happy. It's the way that we feed the dogs. It's the way that we bring home the bacon. It's our subscribers. It's all you guys. Thank you for listening each and every day. That'll do it for me, Gino Camilleri. You can find me on Twitter at GC24_football. Catch my co-host at DiBiaseLOE. Follow the mothership at Locked On Birds. Remember, wherever you get your podcast, rate, subscribe, like, watch us on YouTube, subscribe there as well. But that'll do it for me. I'm Gino Camilleri, ending this as I always do. Fly, Eagles, fly.